So, welcome to another episode of Women Work Wellbeing. I'm really excited to welcome my guest this week. We have Tara Nash, who is, well, Tara does lots of things, but we're here to talk about Tara's new book. She's the author of Conscious Grief. Welcome, Tara.
Well, thank you, Zoe, so much for having me on your podcast. And it's so nice to see you after many years.
I know. That's as soon as we saw each other, we were like, oh, it's been so long. And it's just good, isn't it, to see someone's face?
It really is. It really is.
Well, I know you're super busy because, wow, you are now an author, and we're going to dive into it. I'm going to try not say it too much so everyone listening is like, okay, yeah, we get the point, but I love your book and I am so excited to delve into it. I think you are incredible at what you do. So let's start at the very beginning. Talk to us about what you do and yeah, just give us a little background.
Well, I am a spiritual psychologist and a grief guide, and I don't think anybody sort of begins their life thinking they want to work in grief. There's normally a personal reason for that, and mine was because my parents died when I was younger. So my father died very suddenly of a heart attack, and my mother died of breast cancer, and I was 21 years old. So my whole childhood, actually, there was lots of other losses as well in between those major ones. And when I was 21, I kind of mirrored what my mum had shown me, and I stayed busy and strong and brave. And I moved to London. I worked in fashion. I had my own fashion business by the time I was 28, but I never aspired to be in fashion. So I was always like, what am I doing? But it was good escapism. And I kind of always felt like I wanted to do something more meaningful with my life. And by the time I must have been like 33, 34, I was having therapy. I was doing a lot of self-development workshops and retreats. And I thought, this is really what's interesting for me. And I'd like to move into doing some kind of coaching with other people, helping other people. And I found this master's degree in Los Angeles called spiritual psychology. And that's what moved me, transitioned the beginning of the transition of my career. But when I started that master's, I didn't think death and grieving again. I wasn't aware of that. But in my second year, everybody had the choice of doing a project, and it really could be anything at all. And I was kind of not sure what to do. And somebody on the faculty of staff I went to see, and she suggested that I need to do some work on the death of my father. And I was sort of horrified at that thought to begin with, because I thought, oh God, other people are doing all these fun things and I'm just going to be here grieving. And then I thought about it for a few days, and I was like, actually, I always want to talk about death, but nobody else does, because I'd sort of spent my whole life not talking about it up until that point, and not making it into any big deal, not thinking how it might be impacting my behaviors and choices. So that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to do this project on death and grieving, which meant it was the first time that I started to really read books about the subject. And I was quite shocked that even though I'd had therapists and coaches, none of them had ever really explained to me what grief was and how it impacts us. And I think that's quite common, because unless you're somebody that's had a very personal experience of a grief, then I think that this sort of syllabus, even of becoming a therapist, it's just a couple of hours, maybe on grief. And so I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And this is, I think, what I feel like is my purpose, actually. And that was now, I started that master's 10 years ago this year, and it would have been in the 2015, that I thought, okay, this feels like my calling. So it's almost a decade, and of getting to know what I want to teach, and obviously the book came about more recently.
And the book is so brilliant because I love that you draw on all of your amazing podcast interviews with the experts that you've spoken to, which I think adds so much depth and insight and just other viewpoints of other people's experiences, which I think is really powerful because, to your point, you know, I don't know if you actually said this or whether I've just read it in the book, but we're not talking about it, are we? We're not facing grief. And did you then, when you think about, like, you were so young when you lost your parents, how did you handle that at the time, looking back?
Well, yeah, my dad died in 1990, so it was like a completely different world back then because we just didn't have Google or the internet or anything. And my mum got remarried really quickly after my dad died. So that really just meant my dad was sort of forgotten about. And it was just like, you just move on, you just keep going and don't talk about it. And obviously I felt very strange having a dead dad because I didn't know anyone else that had been through that. And honestly, a lot of the time I would just lie. I was quite relieved to have this stepdad for a time because it was like, oh, I don't need to worry about those awkward questions like, where's your dad? What does he do? I can just pretend this other guy's my dad. And then that only lasted till I was 13. Because it's so awkward. I mean, it's awkward as an adult and it's very awkward as a child. And then you, as a child, I would talk to adults and then you tell them your dad's died and they're like, oh my God, that's, you know, and then you end up comforting them. Sometimes I would make jokes about it to help lighten the situation. And I honestly thought grief was something that lasted like a few weeks after somebody died. Like, I didn't realize that it actually can impact us decades later. And then, yeah, because my mum had just shown this very like, nothing slows us down in life. We just keep going. I, you know, totally, obviously I mentioned that, mimicked her. And I just didn't want people to feel sorry for me or be a pity case. And so I didn't talk about it. And it wasn't until that time when I was, you know, I mean, was talking about it in therapy, but really embracing it and really bringing my parents sort of back into my life in some way, even though they're not here. And knowing now that that's such a helpful form of grieving, that we can have these continued relationships with people after they've died.
Yeah, and I thank you for sharing that story, actually. I think there's part of, especially growing up when you were little or when you're at school, about wanting to fit in and wanting to not stand out. So I can totally understand, even though I haven't been in your situation, how having the stepfather figure made it all a bit, I guess, easier to deal with. It didn't make it easier, but that as a child, and I think what I'm trying to say is we need to be having these conversations, don't we? Like, my little boy came home from school and said that they talked about death in their, I think it's PSHE. And I was kind of like taken aback. And then I was kind of like, how do I feel about this? But we need, having read your book and followed the work that you do, we have to be having these conversations, don't we, to help us now and into the future. Do you think that there's a bit of a shift happening, that we're talking about it more now?
I think so, and I think social media has a lot to do with that, because people can express themselves. They can find other people who are talking about things they relate to. I think we're much more open these days, you know, with mental health crisis. And when I started having therapy, I mean, I tried a little bit in my early 20s and I didn't really like the therapist, but I was so embarrassed. I thought, my God, I don't want anyone to know about this. I was very ashamed. People are going to judge me. Now it's like very common to be going to see a therapist. So things have really moved on. And also, when I went to study spiritual psychology, I would sort of look at the person and think, shall I say this spiritual part or just miss that off? Because, you know, people are going to be like, what's that woo-woo nonsense? And that's 10 years ago. And I think in 10 years, there's been a massive shift around spirituality in this country as well. And people really embracing that and realizing how it can be such a useful tool for our mental health.
Yeah, it's exciting. And then for anyone listening that is thinking, well, what is conscious grief? Can you explain it to us?
Yes. So my experience for most of my life was very unconscious in that I'm sorry, I wasn't going towards it. I was running away from it. So anytime I was feeling any sadness or discomfort, I would either eat or shop or drink or party, and we're not very used to uncomfortable. We don't like uncomfortable feelings, and most of us have pretty comfortable existences these days. So, and we have plenty of distractions. And conscious grief, it's like understanding that grief will impact us. It will impact us emotionally, physically, spiritually, and intellectually. And so it's like this holistic thing. Yes, talking about it is really, really good, but also knowing that any physical symptoms you may have, like not being able to sleep or having a bad back or having IBS, these things are related to our emotional state. So your body might be telling you trying to say to you, look, you need to do some work on this. And obviously things like appetite changes and the way that we view the world. Do we trust in life? Maybe not, when you've had a very traumatic experience. So it impacts us in so many different ways. And if we're conscious of it, if we're conscious of our grief, we're going to understand that it's going to impact us in all of these ways. And what can we do to support ourselves and to feel it, and also to have healthy distractions from it as well, but knowing what's healthy and what's not healthy.
Yeah, really. I'm so fascinated by the subject. And there's a section in the book where you talk about the Chinese medicine approach, that they view, the whole body as equal, whereas in Western culture, we kind of separate the brain and everything else is sort of secondary to it. And I think I love the section when you talk about the different therapies, and I'd love to dive into that a little bit more, because obviously each person's grief is personal to them, and no one, I guess, person's experience of grief will be the same. So obviously therapies will work for different people. And I love when you had those real experiences of people and how they then went on to offer the therapies, which I think we can relate, as a yoga teacher, you find yoga and then you love it so much that you perhaps might want to teach. So you talk a lot about the therapies. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of them, or any therapies that you've done that helped you in your grieving process?
Well, what was kind of interesting for me is that I was having acupuncture, and it was only because a friend of mine was training to become an acupuncturist. So she said, well, try it and I'll give you some vouchers. And that led me to having therapy. And so they had an in-house therapist, and they said, because the acupuncture sort of opens you up, we have this lady here that people can go and speak to. And I thought, oh God, I don't really need to see her, And then something happened in my life, it was a relationship drama. And I thought, oh, maybe I should go and see that lady. So acupuncture was really, really changed my life in that way. And I always sort of say to people, try and have a 3-pronged approach. Like, do something, do some talking, do something for your body, whether it's acupuncture or Reiki or massage. There's so many different things out there, and develop a spiritual practice, whether that be yoga or journaling, a walk in nature, it could be your own, anything of your own interpretation, but sort of have these different approaches that help you process your emotions through your body, your mind, and your soul.
And on the idea of just journaling, I love your I don't know if they're journal prompts or just thoughts or questions to consider at the end of each chapter, and it really got my mind thinking. And I'm reading your book as someone that isn't grieving. Maybe there's stored trauma from years ago, but it's those questions are really powerful to get you just thinking a little bit, and as you absorb the information that you give. So I absolutely love that. And I love the way you break up the chapters. And I need to ask you about modern mourning. And I
Mm.
love the section when you talk about how, how death moved from the home. So the person used to be at the home, and then it was moved to sort of funeral parlors, and we sort of started to disassociate. Can you talk to us a little bit about mourning and what we're used to, and how mourning helps?
Absolutely, because the traditional time that first of all, there's a difference between grief and mourning. So grief is like the internal process that all the feelings that we experience, and then mourning is the outward expression of our grief. And most of the time, that would be sort of when people come to your house after that person has died, and then you have the funeral, and that's a communal ceremony where it's expected for you to cry and have these emotions, and you talk about the person in the eulogy, and you make the stone in the graveyard and how we honor those people. And then after the funeral, it's like people think, oh, that's closure and it's over, which is crazy, because that's no time at all. Actually, most of the time during the you're still in a state of complete shock and denial in those weeks. So mourning can really be anything of your own interpretation and creativity. And it's about, yes, that continued relationship, and how we keep their memory alive. And there's just endless amounts of things that you could do. And I mean, I did do things like, sponsored walks, breast cancer walks, and my sisters and I did various fundraising things. But I think more recently, like in the pandemic, when we had time on our hands and everybody had time on their hands, I thought it would be really nice to speak to my parents' friends and colleagues and people that they knew, and sort of interview them in a way and get to know them through other people's perspectives. So that is like a mourning, ritual in a sense, because you're like remembering them, you're honoring them, you're keeping the memories alive. And that was a really rewarding sort of little project that I did, and made me feel really close to my parents. It made me really think, wow, like they really were amazing people. And you also kind of, grief can be such a sort of selfish thing in a weird way. Like you think it's all your pain and your loss and all of that. But my parents impacted so many people, so that means their death impacted a lot of people as well. And they, of course, their friends missed them and missed not having them here as well. So yeah, that was a really, really rewarding sort of process that I did, which at the time I wasn't thinking it was like modern mourning. And I've interviewed or worked with so many different people who have done creative things like, making jewelry out of things that they had, or framing letters and putting them on the wall, so having memories of their handwriting. Obviously we see park benches in loving memory of people, but yeah, it could be, like making an altar, keeping one bedroom in your house like a sanctuary of all of their things. And often people are like, no, you have to clear everything out, you have to move on, and there are no rules for this stuff. It's what's right for you, and really encouraging people, like you say, it's a very unique thing, grief, and everybody does it differently. So it's your process to be creative with.
I love that. And just to your point, what you said about people sort of say, you need to clear out and you need to do this. It's like society's expectations, or what we're told. Once the funeral's done, it's a tick, and then you do this and then you do that. But I think what your book has just opened up my perspective to helping loved ones with grief and having those conversations, because you've had such a personal experience of it, and you share so openly in the book about the different emotions that you went through. And sometimes I think because of the way we are in society and not having this open dialogue, that perhaps if someone's listening to this and they're maybe not grieving but they know someone that is, I think it's just so important to have the conversations and to hear personal stories so that we can help others in that process. And in the book, you cover so many different, you talk about the different definitions of grief. You talk about, there was a theory on the 5 stages of grief, which was a bit contentious because that's quite linear. And I know you have a group program. Is there a way, are there stages that you follow that for anyone listening, they're like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing? Is there a recommended way that you work with your program, or is it case by case?
Yeah, it is really a case by case, because some people might come to me and it's the death, if it is grieving a death, may have just happened, and the other people might be 2 years out. So yeah, I don't have like a specific kind of route. It's more like educating people that there are different things that they can do to support themselves, and just being in a small group of other people who've shared a similar loss, because there's not many times in our normal social situations where people really want to listen. And we often don't want to burden other people with our difficult emotions. So this is a safe place to be able to do that. And I was just thinking, I mean, most people I work with are grieving the death of somebody or a relationship. But, your podcast is called Jobs for Women. And I think there's so much grief in being a woman, actually. And whether that's, the different stages that we go through with starting, your menstrual cycle, or the menopause, giving up work to become a mom, for example, like that's a big deal. That's like giving up a big part of yourself, in order to support your family, and a sacrifice, or just becoming a parent is a big grief, So like grief is so much more than just the death of somebody. Like it's like, I honestly think every issue in our life is a grief issue, but we put a lot of emphasis on like what makes us happy, on success in terms of jobs or finance or this and that. And it's like, there's not many people going, oh, listen, tend to your pain, sit with your pain, honor your sadness and things like that. And that's what I do, basically.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought that up. And to your point about the women thing, I've recorded something, I can't remember what it was earlier. I think it was like gender pay gap, and talking about the fact that, as women, if you choose to have children and then you take a step back, it's kind of like, not only are you grieving your old life, which I think I definitely went through, and then we left London, but also if you are taking a step back from your career to maybe look for part-time work or work that isn't as demanding, you are sort of giving up that career, and it is a process. And I just don't think we acknowledge it enough as a society, do we? And I love what you just said about, it's like focusing on how to make myself happier and how can I strive to get there, but we're not being in the moment and we're not sitting with it. And I say that to my children, especially my little boy. I'm like, if you want to cry, you cry. You let that emotion flow through your body. And I always say it to him, and now he'll sort of repeat it back to me. It's like, I feel sad or I have a worry. And I love it, because I'm like, you are not that emotion. It just needs to flow through your body. Whereas when we were growing up, going back to how your mum sort of taught you to just crack on, I think it was a little bit like that's the way it was. We just didn't talk about how we felt, did we?
No, we
How
didn't.
how did we get through that?
We did not. It was not a thing at all. And, sometimes I speak to people and they're like, yeah, well, now it's gone a little bit we're on the other end of the extreme. But I think it's great that you're talking. I think that you're talking to your son like that. And encouraging him. I mean, and I will say in my mum's defense, like, she was always concerned about me because I didn't show my emotion, because I was very shut down and in this state of numbness all the time. So she would always be like worried about me because I wasn't crying. And she did try and get me to go to a therapist. But yeah, I just was determined to figure it all out on my own, which I think a lot of people can probably relate to that too. And like I say, this sort of feeling that we have of therapy being a weakness, you know, and now understanding that it takes a lot of strength to confront yourself and your patterns and your weaknesses or strengths or whatever, your vulnerabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to someone recently about that. Like, I feel like there is a little bit of a movement on the whole therapy piece, but we just want to see more of it, more people sharing their raw, I don't know, whatever's going on with them. And like you say, it takes courage, takes balls to do that.
It does. It's hard work. It's hard work. You know, it's much easier to deflect and be distracted. But, you know, it took me 2 decades to really start grieving. And that's the other thing I would say to people, like, there's no timeline, and you might have a really busy life right now. Maybe your parents have both died, but you have small children and a full-time job, and you can't just sit in front of the TV and cry all day. That's like your life, just there is no space for that. And that's okay too. Like, don't feel this pressure like you have to be super conscious in everything. Like, it will be there when it's ready, and when you have this space in your life, then you can process it.
I think that's really good advice, because we do pile that pressure on, don't we? That someone listening might listen to this podcast and think, oh my gosh, I need to do that now. But I think that's really, really important for people to listen to, that it'll come when it's ready or when you're ready. I know we've got to wrap up soon, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about triggers, because something that you said earlier about celebrating someone's life, some people might do, you know, framing a letter or keeping their things or having a room, and other people might not do that. Is there anything in that relates to triggers, or can you talk to us a little bit about triggers?
Well, I think people say a lot of triggering things, and they don't necessarily mean it. But for example, you know, are you not over it yet? Or that's weird. Why haven't you cleared out their things? That's not going to help you move on. And as the person who's grieving, we're in such a sensitive place. So it's tricky to get things right, honestly. But I think if you're really a conscious person, you know, then you're going to understand that you're going to be triggered. People are going to say annoying and unhelpful things, and you might react in the moment, or you may, you know, you may have enough tools that you don't, and you can understand that that person is, you know, coming from their point of view, and that's not necessarily what you think and you believe. So just knowing that you are in an ultra sensitive place, and over time, you know, your reactions are going to change. But yeah, we are, you know, a lot of like jealousy may come up because, hey, like those people still have the grandparents for their children, or that woman has her husband, or, you know, people say really, oh, at least, imagine losing one of your kids and somebody says, well, at least you have another child. Like, can you imagine like how upsetting that is? But people say a lot of stupid shit like that. And unfortunately, it is part of the whole shit parcel, as I have said.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, being aware of what you're saying, oh my God, when you actually take a moment just to think about that, like the things that people say that just pile on, just make it even more horrific. But I just wanted to go back to a point about those emotions, you know, because there was a part in the book where the anecdotes about, you know, feeling anger or jealousy, like, well, they've got their grandparents, or walking in the park and they've got their husband, and there are so many emotions that we go through, and same with what we talked about earlier about perhaps a woman grieving her old career or her old life. So many emotions come with it. Have you got any tips for dealing with those emotions? Like, how do you do it with your group?
Well, some people are not even very aware of their feelings. And so we do a whole session on feeling the feelings and identifying them, because most people, you will say, "How are you feeling?" And they won't say. They will tell you what's happened in their day. Because, like you say, we're all very illiterate. We didn't grow up explaining what was going on inside of us. So I give people a link to a feelings wheel, which has like lots and lots of different types of feelings, to try and encourage people to pinpoint the feeling. You know, where is the feeling? Where do you feel it in your body? Get used to identifying your feelings as opposed to sort of acting out from an unconscious place. And so we do exercises in, like, I set up a WhatsApp group, and you know, to try and get people to observe how they're feeling. And of course, we have so many different feelings go through us in a day. So then it's also, you become aware of how they come and they go and they change. And like you said earlier with teaching your little boy, like, we are not the feeling, you know, this is something that's happening, but it will also change. And knowing that we won't always feel the same way. And because becoming a lot more aware about what's going on internally. And then the other thing, you know, which is, it's not for everybody, but journaling. Because sometimes some of us are more articulate with writing. You know, if we let it out on the page, no one's there to like tell us not to feel that way, or to, you know, that we feel like we're going to be judged or told, you know, that that's not acceptable. So writing things out is a very, very good way of processing and just getting the feelings out. Like, if I can't sleep, that's personally what I will always do. I will write.
That's such brilliant advice, and I'm definitely going to print out that feelings wheel, because they do it at school. Like, they'll have like a chart and they'll ask them to pick where they are, but that's such great advice. Like, we aren't always in touch with our feelings, or it's the cliche or the standard, "How are you?" "Yes, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?" Like a robot.
Totally.
It was just fascinating to chat with you, Tara. I could go on and on and on and on. I just have to say that anyone listening to this, it's one of those books that you can dip and dive into, a great gift for others. And I just think it will open your mind. There it is, if you're watching on YouTube. It's fabulous. And Tara, if people want to connect with you, where is the best place to find you?
Probably I have two websites now. So there's consciousgrief.co.uk or tara-nash.com. And really subscribing to my newsletter is the best way, because then you can see the offerings that I have in terms of grief yoga, breath work, the group coaching program, and individual coaching.
Perfect. And I'll put the link in the show notes, or the links. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And it was so good to see you.
You too, Zoe. Thank you very much.